안녕하세요. 자본시장연구원 정화영입니다. 이번 KCMI 글로벌 이슈에서는 미 연준의 통화정책 기조 및 향후 전망을 주제로 인터뷰를 진행하겠습니다. 먼저 오늘 주제에 대해 말씀해 주실 앤드류 레빈 교수님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 레빈 교수님은 다트머스 대학 경제학과 교수이시며 현재 섀도우 오픈마켓 커미티 위원과 IMF 비지팅 스칼러로 활동하고 계십니다. 다트머스 대학으로 옮기시기 이전에는 미 연준과 IMF에서 총 23년간 근무하셨으며 특히 2010년부터 2012년에는 연준에서 특별 보좌관을 역임하셨습니다. 또한 유럽 중앙은행, 한국은행 등 주요국 중앙은행의 고문 및 비지팅 스칼러로 활동하셨습니다. 통화정책의 전문가이신 레빈 교수님과 이렇게 이야기 나눌 수 있게 된 것을 정말 기쁘게 생각합니다. 그럼 미 연준의 통화정책에 대한 인터뷰를 시작하겠습니다. 물가 상승에 대응하여 연준의 금리 인상이 당초 예상보다 더 빠르게 진행될 것으로 예상됩니다. 다가올 금리 인상에 대하여 금융시장이 잘 준비되어 있다고 생각하시는지, 그리고 향후 연준의 통화정책에 있어 위험 요인은 무엇이라고 생각하시는지 말씀 부탁드립니다.
Okay, great. So first of all, as we're doing this interview, it's just been a little more than 24 hours since the Federal Reserve finished their latest policy meeting, the Federal Open Market Committee. So this is a really opportune time to talk with you and your colleagues about these issues because we have really fresh information from the Federal Reserve. One thing I could do is just show you really briefly here. This is the statement that they issued. The big step that they took on Wednesday was that for the past couple of years, the Federal Reserve's been holding the short-term interest rate. The target for the federal funds rate's been held essentially at zero. And now they took the very first step, raising that interest rate target by a quarter percentage point. There was some discussion over the last few weeks about possibly making a bigger move, but in the end, the committee decided to just make a single quarter point rate hike. So let's come to your question. To what extent market participants in the United States, in Korea, in Europe, and all over the world are really prepared for what the Federal Reserve may need to do over the next year or two? And I think, unfortunately, that's made difficult by the extent to which the Federal Reserve has been very slow to start the process of normalizing monetary policy. Inflation started picking up a year ago, but the Federal Reserve didn't move the interest rate target at that time. They waited all the way until now. And even at this first step, it's only I call it a baby step. Okay, just a very first step. Now, the Federal Reserve, as I mentioned, does release 4 times a year their economic projections. What each participant around that table thinks is the most likely course for the US economy over the next several years and what monetary policy is going to be appropriate in those circumstances. Let me show you what that looks like, because again, we have this fresh just, this week to be able to see what their latest outlook is. Okay, so this is called the Summary of Economic Projections, and it was posted on their webpage at 2 o'clock US time this Wednesday, March 16th. And I want to just skip forward here to what many people call the dot plot. Okay, but what you see here is a bunch of dots. Each dot here is for a given year, and in particular, it's for their projection for the appropriate level of monetary policy at the end of that calendar year. Each individual dot is a single person around the table, their view of what that person thinks is the most appropriate monetary policy. But what you see in the dot plot here is that now, as of this week, the typical participant expects that the federal funds rate is going to need to be somewhere around 2% by the end of this year. How do you get to 2%? Well, they've got 6 more meetings left. Okay, remember they meet 8 times a year. They've got 6 more meetings left. Okay, if they were to raise the federal funds rate by a quarter point at each of those 6 meetings, that would bring them up to just under 2%. Okay, so these 5 dots are people on the FOMC, on the Federal Reserve's Monetary Policy Committee, who think that they're going to make a quarter-point hike, that they should make a quarter-point hike at each of the next 6 meetings to bring the federal funds rate to just below 2% by the end of this year. There are 4 people who don't think quite that much tightening would be necessary. And there's some up here, 6 people in this little group and 1 more way up here, who must be thinking that the Federal Reserve is going to have to make some larger policy moves. It's some of these 6 meetings coming up over this year, that some of those moves might need to be a 0.5 percentage point move. Okay, so we can see, again, there's a range of views here, which is healthy. But the main point here is that even over these next 9 months, most Federal Reserve officials, they're no longer in the mode of thinking that they only need to move once or twice this year. Almost all of them think that they're going to need to move at every single meeting. And some of them think they might need to move more than that. Now, look forward a year to the end of 2023. And here, the middle of this distribution is around 3%. So they're expecting that they're not going to be done by the end of this year, that they're going to have more work to do, at least probably 4 or 5 meetings in next year, that they will also need to continue raising the federal funds rate. Okay, so this is clear upward slope here. A lot of work to do this year and some next year. Okay, that's their current judgment about the appropriate policy. That's already a very big shift just over the last 3, 4, 5 months compared to what they were expecting as of last fall, even as of last December. This is a very big move. Now, my question, we can discuss this. I'm going to pause for a moment here so you can tell me, is I don't actually think this is likely to be enough. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. Actually, Larry Summers published a commentary yesterday in the Washington Post. He said that he thinks the Federal Reserve probably will need to raise interest rates to around 5%. 5% isn't even on this chart here. Okay, that would be way up here. Okay, outside the scale of this chart. Okay, why is that? So this is the range of projections of the committee participants for the inflation rate, the U.S. inflation rate, and their preferred measure is a part of the national accounts. It's the price index for personal consumption expenditures, PCE, personal consumption expenditures price index. Okay, that's the measure that the Federal Reserve generally uses to gauge the level of inflation, and its target is a 2% inflation rate for PCE price index. And what you see is that this thing's been going up fast. Last year, it was above 5%. Federal Reserve officials, as of this week, are expecting it to come back. They think that it'll be around 4% by the end of this year and down around 2.5% by the end of next year, and then settle in close to their target by 2024. And that is the question. That is the question, not just for the Federal Reserve. That's the question for financial market investors in Korea, for business people all over the world, for consumers too, okay, because everyone's affected by the Federal Reserve's decisions, okay. This is a guess, just a guess, what the Federal Reserve officials might think might happen to the U.S. inflation rate over the coming year. But I think there's very strong reasons to think that the U.S. inflation rate is not going to come down. In fact, it's if anything more likely to be going up over the next 9 months, and we can talk through the reasons for that. Okay, but if inflation is going to stay high or even perhaps rise further, then the Federal Reserve is going to have to move its policy rate significantly further than in this dot plot. Okay, so what market participants and other central banks and people around the world need to be alert to is over the next several months, over the next 6 months, over the next 9 months or a year, what's happening to the U.S. inflation rate. because the best case we can possibly hope for is the Federal Reserve is right, that US inflation is going to start heading down pretty soon, and that means that they won't need to change the level of interest rates very far. But if they're wrong, and they certainly have been wrong over the past year, so no one should be surprised if they're wrong again, that hope is not fulfilled, then I think that they probably will need to raise the federal funds rate. Maybe it's well above 5% in order to make sure that inflation gets under control, US inflation gets stabilizes, and then they'll have to come up with a plan for how they're going to bring it down over time. It may not just naturally subside on its own. The Federal Reserve may need to take active steps to facilitate that, and so those are going to be really important questions going forward.
다음으로 시장금리에 대해 질문드리겠습니다. 연준의 금리 인상이 예상되는 가운데 금융시장에서는 미 국채 2년물과 10년물 간 금리 스프레드가 축소되고 있습니다. 10년물 실질금리도 여전히 마이너스 금리를 기록하며 매우 낮은 수준입니다. 이러한 지표들이 연준의 시사하는 바가 무엇이라고 생각하시는지 말씀 부탁드립니다.
Okay, that's a really great question. Now, what we need to understand here, and the Federal Reserve has not been very good about explaining this to the public, is that what matters for the economy is the interest rate adjusted for inflation. Okay, we call it the inflation adjusted interest rate. In fact, it's so central to the way macroeconomists and monetary economists think about how the economy works. The problem the Federal Reserve is facing right now is inflation's running above 5%, and the federal funds rate is still close to zero. We call that a negative real interest rate because the level of interest rates is way, way below the inflation rate. I think that's adding fuel to the inflation fire. And so, unfortunately, unless the Fed turns out to be very lucky, unfortunately, the policy the Fed's going to follow over the next 6 months or a year could make the inflation situation worse. Because even though they're gradually raising interest rates up to 1% and then toward 2%, if inflation's continuing to run at 5% or 6% or 7%, which is what consumers are expecting, that's still a very negative rate. And that's still going to be consistent with a pretty rapid growth in the economy, and probably making the inflation situation even worse. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to show you, let's take a look at the bond market as of right now. Okay, but this is off of Bloomberg.com. They have a nice page for interest rates in many countries, but here let's just focus on the ones for the United States. Okay, the Treasury yields going out from 3-month Treasury bills all the way out to the 30-year notes. Okay, and the column that we're really interested in here is the one that's labeled yield. This is as of 5 o'clock Eastern time, US Eastern time, Thursday, 17th of March. Okay, now what's interesting here to look at is that at the horizon of 5 years and 10 years, the Treasury yields are almost identical. 2.14% for the 5-year, 2.17 for the 10-year. Okay, so we would say that part of the yield curve is quite flat. Okay, the yield curve is nowhere close to being inverted right now because, of course, the short-term yields are still very low. The 3-month Treasury bill rate is roughly similar to what people think the Fed's going to be doing over the next 3 months. So that's still below 0.5%. Okay, and because investors now understand that the Fed's going to be tightening over the next year, this yield curve is upward sloping here, going all the way from 0.4% at the near end up to around 2.1%, 2.2% at the 5 to 10 year range. Now, as we move through the next 9 months to December, these 3 and 6 month and 12 month rates are going to pick up somewhat, right? Because the Fed's tightening. Okay, we're moving along that path that I showed you a few minutes ago in the dot plot. Okay, but even at the end of this year, the 12-month rate might still be up at 1.5 or 1 3/4, according to the Fed's plan. What's wrong with that plan is actually obvious here when you look down at the next panel. These are called inflation protected securities. And the reason they have that name is because the US Treasury Department, when inflation is above zero, compensates investors for the amount of inflation that affects the real value of those securities. Okay, they give them an extra payment to make up for inflation. Okay, now these yields here are in negative territory. As I said, the inflation adjusted interest rate right now is like negative 5%. And even with the Fed's tightening that it has in mind, if inflation continues running at 5% over the coming year, and the Fed raises the level of the dollar interest rate by 2 percentage points, we'll still have a very negative real interest rate even at the end of this year. Okay, they're not going to be even getting to neutral. A neutral monetary policy is, roughly speaking, a zero level of the inflation adjusted interest rate. Okay, now we can go back here and we can compare these two panels, and let's just do it at the 5-year horizon. Okay, so we're going to compare this yield, the 2.14, that's the yield on a 5-year treasury as of this afternoon in the United States. Okay, and compare that to the yield on a inflation protected security at the 5-year maturity. Okay, and the difference between those two, 2.14 minus negative 1.47, that's the amount of inflation compensation that investors are expecting to receive, that we call it arbitrage, makes them roughly indifferent between holding the nominal 5-year at a yield of 2.14 versus the inflation protected yield of negative 1.47. Okay, so let's subtract. 2.14 minus a negative is like adding a positive. So 2.14 plus 1.47 tells you that investors today are expecting that over the next 5 years, the average inflation rate in the United States is going to be 3.6%. 3.6%. Now remember, the Fed's target is 2%. So what this tells you here is the bond markets have lost a lot of credibility, a lot of confidence in the Federal Reserve's commitment to its inflation target. Bond markets no longer think the Federal Reserve is going to be taking the actions needed to bring inflation back all the way toward 2% anytime soon. And I think it's very unfortunate. I think that the Federal Reserve needs to explain better what it's doing. It needs to have a better plan. It needs to explain more clearly the contingencies if the hope of inflation subsiding doesn't materialize. What's the Fed's plan for making sure that inflation does come back toward its target over time? Okay, now we can ask the question of how close is the real yield curve to being inverted? Because remember what I said here before is that what matters to the real economy is the real interest rate, the inflation adjusted interest rate. Okay, that's the one where we want to know, is it getting inverted? And the answer to that is that investors think that the real yield as of right now, the short-term real yield, is something like -4, -5%, and they're expecting that over time the real yield is going to come back up towards zero. That's actually a very steep real yield curve. Why is there so much confusion in the financial markets about this? Well, I think part of the reason is because the Federal Reserve hasn't explained very well what's going on and what its plans are, and some people are confused. Another factor is because we're in a very different world than we've been for the last 3 decades, where investors have been used to and kind of taken for granted that inflation would remain around 2%, that they could just abstract from that and ignore it and just look at the dollar interest rates and the nominal yield curve. But now, because we're in a really different world here where inflation's elevated and it's been elevated and it's probably remain elevated for the next several years, investors really need to refocus on the real yield curve. So the good news is the real yield curve is in fact upward sloping. So the fears about recession are probably overblown. But the bad news is the Federal Reserve is very, very far behind the curve. It's adding fuel to the inflationary inferno, and that could make the inflation problem worse. And we have seen this before. The last time this happened was in the 1970s. US inflation went all the way up into double digits. And then unfortunately, what the Federal Reserve did in 1981, 82 was to hit the brakes, to slam on the brakes. The federal funds rate went all the way up to 20% for a brief period, very high real interest rates. And that did cause a recession. And that was the action. Paul Volcker was the Federal Reserve chair at the time. The Federal Reserve thought was appropriate and needed in order to bring inflation back under control. So if the Federal Reserve remains behind the curve long enough, then there will be a risk that the Federal Reserve at some point is going to have to hit the brakes hard. And then that could threaten not just the US economy, but a lot of other economies as well.
다음은 인플레이션에 대한 질문입니다. 미국 소비자 물가 상승률이 40년 만에 가장 높은 수준을 기록하며 인플레이션이 경제의 위험 요인으로 작용할 가능성이 높아지고 있는데요. 앞으로의 인플레이션 전망에 대한 교수님의 의견을 부탁드립니다.
Okay, so why don't we talk this through? Where did this inflation come from? Why did it start? Okay, and the fundamental reason is what we call supply chains. That a lot of the products that U.S. consumers purchase, many of the parts and components of those products are made in other countries in a very complex chain. The raw materials might come from Brazil. Those raw materials are sent to Singapore. There's some processing, then they're sent to Korea. Korea produces some components. Korea sends those to Taiwan. Taiwan does some more processing, sends it to Hong Kong. Hong Kong, produces does some more processing, and then it goes in a container ship back to Los Angeles, and is shipped by train to Texas or Chicago. You see, right? It's a very long, complex chain. And that chain has been fine-tuned very carefully over decades. So if you ask me what's my outlook for the supply chain disruptions, my presumption at this point is they're going to probably continue to be very bad, maybe for another year, maybe longer than that. Like a traffic jam, once it gets clogged up, it takes a long, long time to get all the cars moving again and get people onto their destinations. And that's probably what we're going to see with the supply chains. Okay, so that was the initial impetus for the US inflation. The next part of this was that because the Federal Reserve has had a very easy monetary policy, very accommodative monetary policy, has contributed to a housing boom in the United States that looks a lot like the housing boom we had in the early to mid 2000s before the global financial crisis. House prices in many areas, rising at a rate of 10, 15, 20% per year. A lot of that's being passed through into rents. So people who aren't homeowners are facing higher and higher rates of rent on their housing cost. And so over the past year, the cost of housing in the US Consumer Price Index has gone from, say, 2%. Now it's up to around 4 or 5% and still rising. And that's completely distinct from the supply chain disruptions, right? This is, has nothing to do with container ships or trucks and trains. It has all to do with the fact that in an era of very low interest rates and low mortgage rates, house prices have skyrocketed. And if someone's deciding whether to live in their house or rent it out, of course, those are the kinds of arbitrage decisions that over time lead the cost of rent to rise in line with the increase in house prices. And so that's what we're seeing. And this is going to be a very persistent factor probably for the next several years before the increase in house prices that we've already seen fully passes through into the cost of rent and the owner equivalent rent that shows up in the consumer price index. Okay, then there's a third factor, which is that because the labor market has strengthened very quickly in the United States, workers are experiencing very significant cost of living increases. Food, gasoline, rent, and of course, all these other customer items that they're purchasing. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the average hourly earnings of US ordinary workers. And literally, this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics series for production workers and non-supervisory workers. So it excludes executives and it excludes people who are involved in sales jobs where a lot of their pay is in the form of bonuses. Okay, and on the left side of this figure, you see the data prior to the pandemic in 2018 and 2019. And on the right-hand side, you see what's been happening since the worst part of the pandemic was over. There's a part in here in the middle that's I've cut out because it makes the graph too difficult to read. It was very, very volatile series for a few months in there. Okay, but what you see here is, by the way, there's a red line for the 6-month change at an annual rate. And then the blue line is the change over the last 12 months. But both of those are pretty stable in the range of 3.5, maybe up to 4% here prior to the pandemic. Remember, that was a period when the overall inflation rate was rising at around 2%. Consumer inflation was close to 2%. Okay, nominal wages are growing at 3 to 4. That meant that workers were getting some real wage increases and adjusted for inflation, okay, because the level of nominal wage growth was generally a percentage point or two above the inflation rate. Well, we go over here, what you see is very rapid increases. Now the nominal wage growth is up around 6.5%, and pretty much the same for the last 6 months as over the last 12, okay? But in real terms, that means that workers are just barely keeping up with the cost of living because the US CPI, the Consumer Price Index, over the last 12 months is close to 7%. So unlike the good old days before the pandemic, where workers' wages were rising faster than inflation, over this past year, the growth rate has picked up, but barely enough to keep up with the increase in the consumer inflation rate. So where is this going to head? Well, assuming that we have continue to have a strong labor market this year, I won't be surprised if these series pick up further. Nominal wage growth could go to 7%, 8%, 9%. And of course, it's not free. The labor costs are a significant part of the cost of operating a business. So, so the businesses that pay those cost of living increases are going to probably have to pass it through into their prices. So now you add that on top of the supply chain disruptions and the increases in housing costs. Okay, we have a third major factor here, which is why I will be very surprised if inflation heads downward. My guess is, if anything, it's going to be heading upward. And it seems very unlikely to me that inflation will subside in the way that the Fed is currently projecting. And then we're back to the first question you asked, which is financial market participants and central banks around the world should be prepared for the possibility that US inflation continues to be high or moves upward, and that the Federal Reserve actually has to move a lot further in terms of bringing interest rates upward. Not that that would necessarily cause a US recession, but just bring it upward so that the real interest rate is back to neutral, meaning roughly in line with the inflation rate. Unfortunately, as long as the Fed is moving slowly toward neutral, creates a bigger and bigger risk that US inflation does get entrenched at a high level, and that we see a repeat of the 1970s where a new, Federal Reserve leadership has to come in and take very tough decisions to tighten enough for inflation to start coming back down again. I really hope we don't get there.
팬데믹 이후 완화적인 금융 환경이 지속되면서 주식, 부동산 등 자산 가격이 크게 상승했습니다. 일부에서는 역사적 기준에 비해 자산 가치가 높은 수준임을 지적하며 자산 고평가에 대한 우려를 나타내고 있습니다. 이러한 자산 가격이 연준의 통화 정책과 관련하여 금융 안정성에 위협이 될 수 있다고 생각하십니까?
So, a basic principle in asset pricing is that many assets, like a share of stock in a company, is a share of ownership and a right to the earnings of that company over many years to come. And when the level of the real interest rate is very low, then the value of all those earnings going out to a very far distance into the future are valuable today. As the level of the real interest rate starts to rise, investors, in effect, become more concerned with the nearer term outcomes. And so that can be difficult for smaller companies, for fast growth companies, for companies that aren't yet making a lot of money, but hope to make a lot in the future. And so in a world like we've had lately, where the real interest rate is very negative, in some way is a great world to be in if you're a fast growth company that's trying to raise money. Because if your rate of return is positive 5%, and investors are comparing that to a negative 5% real return on holding treasury securities, then they're really going to want to buy your stock. And so that would push up the asset prices. So we will see probably that I'm guessing in this world where US inflation stays high and the Federal Reserve has to move interest rates up, there will be pressures on some asset prices. That's why it's really important for the Federal Reserve to explain its policies clearly and to have a strategy, as opposed to kind of making things, by surprise. On the one hand, if the Federal Reserve is too cautious, they could try to protect the level of asset prices in the stock market. But the cost of that is going to be getting inflation entrenched at an even higher level. On the other side, if they start moving very abruptly and people don't understand what the Fed's plan is anymore, that uncertainty could undermine asset prices, and it could lead to a big contraction in the stock market. So there's no question here that this is a challenge for the Federal Reserve. They need to have a plan. They need to explain the plan clearly to the public, to the financial markets, to members of Congress. The Congress is the US Federal Reserve's boss. And Congress has a right to know what's the plan here, because everyone wants inflation to be low and stable. And right now, the Fed is not accomplishing that. So the asset prices are one part of the picture here, but the critical part of the picture is ordinary families who need to pay the rent and pay for the gasoline and buy food for their children. And that's why the first and foremost commitment of the Federal Reserve under US law is to foster maximum employment and price stability. The Fed's job is not to try to boost the stock market.
마지막으로 정부 부채와 관련된 질문 드리겠습니다. 팬데믹 이후 재정 지출 확대 등으로 정부 부채가 빠르게 늘어났습니다. 우리나라 역시 비슷한 상황인데요. 취약계층 지원을 위한 재정 확대 필요성과 통화정책 정상화 필요성을 함께 고려해야 하는 어려운 상황에서 중앙은행에 대한 정책 제언 부탁드립니다.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think the foremost responsibility of the central bank is to foster price stability. In Korea, the value of the won needs to be stable, so that when a business is deciding what prices to charge and it's making plans to expand the business, that they can count on the value of the won being reasonably stable over coming years. And the same for a consumer, for someone who's planning to retire soon. Okay, it's critical. The stability of prices is critical to the functioning of a market economy. And that's true from the poorest countries in the world. In Africa, I've been an advisor, working with the IMF for some of those countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and it's true for the wealthiest countries in the world too. These same points apply to Norway and Sweden and Switzerland. Okay, and of course to Korea. So that's the foremost responsibility of the central bank, is to keep inflation low and stable. Fiscal policy should be a separate problem that elected officials have to make tough decisions. That may mean we want to spend more on one thing, we have to cut back on some spending somewhere else, like a family. Okay, and really ideally, a country like Korea, people are making decisions together, consulting with each other, recognizing the challenges and making hard decisions. We want to help these people who are vulnerable. We have to make some tough choices because nothing's free. Okay, that's a fiscal decision. Okay, another possibility is you say, well, we want to do something to help these vulnerable people. We have to pay for it. Okay, well, maybe the right solution is to raise taxes somewhere else. Okay, that's a tough decision because no one likes taxes. Okay, so raising taxes, might in a family where people are working together and supporting each other, and someone's vulnerable who really needs help, and the rest of the family is willing to do what they need to do to help that person. Okay, now another possibility is you say, well, let's borrow the money. Okay, we'll pay it back later. And there are certainly times when that's appropriate for a family to do. But you have to be careful about it. If we say, oh, well, we're going to go on a really nice family vacation, we're just going to put it on a credit card. Well, then I have to be prepared to make the payments out of our monthly budget for months or years to come to pay for that family vacation later, which means I'm really only postponing a lot of the tough choices, because in order to make those credit card payments down the road, I'm either going to have to work overtime or we're going to have to cut back on something else. Okay, so sometimes just putting it onto taking out a debt to pay for it is just a way of postponing the painful decisions that need to be made. Okay, I feel strongly that societies should be helping vulnerable people. And the pandemic has been horrible. I think Korea, fortunately, has been spared from a lot of the worst of it. The United States, we have nearly 1 million people who've died from COVID in the past 2 years. We probably have a lot of lessons to learn from Korea about how we can have better public health management in the United States, to be ready for another pandemic someday. But the main point is that a family takes care of the elderly people. A family takes care of the kids. A family takes care of if one member lost their job. Okay, the family doesn't kick them out and make them starve. Okay, the family takes care of all the members. And I think for a country, especially a small country, that kind of approach And for political leaders to emphasize that we're all in this together, I think is a very constructive way to do this. By the way, you may know the history of this, but Margaret Thatcher, when she became prime minister in Britain, they had high inflation and they had a terrible problem with the fiscal debt. Okay, and there was a lot of inefficiency in the economy. And when she became prime minister, she said, we're going to try to approach this like a family. Okay, we need to make some tough decisions, but we're going to try to do the best we can to work together as a family. Of course, not everyone agreed with her. There were people who did not like Margaret Thatcher. But the basic principle of what she was trying to do, or at least the way that she was trying to communicate, I think was actually a sensible one. That's a good model for many countries when we're facing tough choices, to try to make sure that the vulnerable people don't get hit the hardest. Those are the ones that actually should be protected. And it might mean that the wealthier people, the people who are more secure, have to take up more of the responsibility.
지금까지 앤드류 레빈 교수님과 함께 미 연준의 통화 정책을 중심으로 다양한 주제에 대해 이야기를 나눠보았습니다. 깊은 통찰을 바탕으로 좋은 말씀 나눠주신 레빈 교수님께 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 주요국 중앙은행의 통화정책 정상화로 금융 환경이 빠르게 변화할 것으로 예상됩니다. 근본 KCMI 글로벌 이슈가 이러한 변화를 이해하고 이에 대한 대응을 준비하는 데 큰 도움이 되길 바랍니다. 인터뷰를 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다.